Cincinnati, you are the closest big city I grew up to. You are the first big city I ever went to. You have given us so much. You have given us one of the best rivalries in college basketball between Cincinnati and Xavier. You have given us some of the best food on the planet in Skyline Chili. Yeah, chili on spaghetti is kind of wild, but you can't knock it until you try it. You gave us some of the best ice cream in the world in Graders. And if you have never had the black raspberry chip, then you are missing out on life. You gave us Harambe, Kings Island, FC Cincinnati, Rose Lavelle, UDF, Kroger, Montgomery Inn. There is a lot from Cincinnati, and if you are from here, then you know how awesome it is. But the two teams of Cincy that everyone bonds to are the Reds and the Bengals. Now, if this was a Reds video, which maybe one day in the future it could be, I would talk about them. But today is about the Cincinnati Bengals and how this team got to the position it is currently in. Because not too long ago, they drafted John Ross over Patrick Mahomes and Deshaun Watson. Now, but not too long ago, they were an extremely competitive team in the NFL and were always making the playoffs, but could just never get over the hump and win a game. The Bengals have been known as a team that gives guys second chances, looking for cheap talent that Marvin could get into shape and turn their lives around. And while we all ridiculed Marvin Lewis for never getting them over the hump, he at least got them to the playoffs 5 straight years with an owner who doesn't spend much or makes great modern day decisions. Now, you are probably asking yourself, what happened to the Bengals that were making the playoffs a couple years ago? And to put it shortly, the team was 22-9 when Harambe was in the Cincinnati Zoo and are now 21-42 since his death. Okay, but seriously, I'm going to talk about the history of the Bengals and look at what happened to them recently. So sit back and let's get into what exactly happened to the Cincinnati Bengals.
Touchdown Bengals, get some points upon that board and win the game for Cincinnati.
Let's go back in time to 1966. The Cincinnati Bengals were founded in the AFL by legendary NFL and Cleveland Browns head coach Paul Brown. The team began playing in 1968, and Brown also was the team's head coach during the early days until the 1975 team. The reason Brown even started the Bengals was because Art Modell, who purchased majority interest in the Browns back in 1961, fired Coach Brown in 1963, so Paul wanted to start his own NFL franchise in Columbus or Cincinnati, but due to the impending merger between the NFL and the AFL, which was going to happen in 1970, the Bengals instead joined the AFL as their 10th and final team. Now, why did Brown choose Cincinnati and the name Bengals? Well, at the time, the Reds were in the town, and they needed another team in the city, and Cincinnati neighbored a lot of other cities, so it was believed they could draw fans. And the name Bengals was chosen because of the former pro football teams that played in Cincinnati during the 30s and 40s, and the Bengals spent their first 2 seasons playing at Cincinnati campus, and then Riverfront Stadium was built during the late 60s and was ready in 1970, and not only was this the home of the Bengals, but the Reds also moved in with them. The first 2 seasons were not great, but then they joined the NFL for the 1970 season, and then they found their guy in 1971, because in the draft, the Bengals selected Ken Anderson, a quarterback from a small college, in the 3rd round of the draft. For the next 16 years, Anderson was the key man of the Cincinnati offense and a 4-time AFC individual passing champion. Cincinnati won its 2nd AFC Central Championship in 1973 and a wildcard berth in 1975 playoffs, which was Brown's final year as the coach. Now, when Brown stepped down after 45 years of coaching at 67 years old, the sport had grown so much. But when Brown just decided to move into their full-time owner spot, this was one of the most critical mistakes that was made in team history. Because after Brown stepped down as head coach, the Bengals had the options to pick from Bill Johnson or Bill Walsh, yes, that Bill Walsh, to become their next head coach. And Walsh was an up-and-coming offensive-minded coach who worked for the Bengals from 1968 through 1975 and implemented the West Coast offense with the Bengals. He turned Virgil Carter into a short-field passer that really suited his skills, and turned Ken Anderson to a really good quarterback, and the West Coast offense really took off in Cincinnati. But Paul Brown decided to hire Bill Johnson instead of Walsh, and by the time Bill Johnson was fired in 1978 after 3 seasons, Bill Walsh had been the offensive coordinator for the Chargers and the head coach of Stanford, and was about to become the head coach of the 49ers. And we all know what happened after that for Walsh and his career. Now, for the Bengals, the Bill Johnson era was a failure. And then Homer Rice took over for almost 2 seasons, and then was fired. But then in 1980, Forrest Gregg took over. And in his 2nd season in 1981, the Bengals hit their stride. That year, the Bengals unveiled their new uniforms with tiger-striped helmets, jerseys, and pants. Cincinnati, with Forrest Gregg as head coach, won the AFC Central with a 12-4 record and defeated San Diego 27-7 in the AFC Championship, but they lost the Super Bowl showdown versus, you guessed it, Bill Walsh and the San Francisco 49ers by the score of 26-21. After that Super Bowl, the Bengals only made the playoffs one more time until the 1988 season. Forrest Gregg left to become the head coach of the Packers, and Sam Weiss replaced him in 1984. During that time, they drafted Boomer Esiason out of Maryland in the second round of the draft in 1984, and he took over after Ken Anderson for full time in 1985. The Bengals didn't make the playoffs the first 4 seasons of the Weiss era, but in 1988, everything hit big. They had a tie for the best record in the NFL, they were undefeated at home, Boomer Esiason was the best quarterback in the NFL that year and won MVP, and they went on to the Super Bowl, but once again, they had to face Bill Walsh and the San Francisco 49ers, and they lost a close game by the score of 20-16. The team missed the playoffs the next year, they made it again in 1990, but this was the last great moment in Bengals history, because right after the start of the 1991 season, Paul Brown passed away on August 5th, 1991, at the age of 82. His son Mike Brown, who had already taken over for his dad, but now it really was his full time to shine, was now the full-time owner. And after the death of Paul Brown, the Bengals won 14 straight seasons without a winning record, and they had so many draft busts and different coaches, and nothing worked out. Basically, the only thing that happened to the Bengals was they moved out of Riverfront Stadium and built their own, and the Reds planned on doing the same. Paul Brown Stadium was built in 1998 and opened in 2000. And Great American Ballpark broke ground in 2000 and opened in 2003, and then Riverfront Stadium was destroyed. But 2003 was the changing moment in the history of the team, because the Bengals hired Marvin Lewis in January of 2003, and he was taking over a team that had fallen on hard times, and Marvin was one of the guys that was probably ready for this job the most. They began by drafting Carson Palmer out of USC in the draft, and he became the new face of the franchise. Carson was an all-time great Heisman-winning quarterback at USC, so he was ready to take over the Bengals and be their next Ken Anderson or Boomer Esiason. Carson didn't play in 2003, and John Kitna started and won Comeback Player of the Year, and the Bengals went 8-8 in 2003 and 2004. In 2005, the team finally had a winning record and made the playoffs for the first time since 1990 with Carson Palmer, but the team lost in the playoffs when Carson Palmer got injured on the second play of the game. But after 2005, the team was constantly hit with injuries, mediocre play, and in 2009, they finally turned it back around and made the playoffs again. In 2009, the Bengals returned to the playoffs, and they had swept the Steelers and the Ravens, who both made the AFC title game the previous year, and Marvin Lewis won Coach of the Year, and this team looked pretty good. But they lost in the playoffs to the Jets 24-14, and then in 2010, the Bengals went 4-12, and after that, Carson Palmer demanded a trade, and he just retired since the Bengals wouldn't move him, and then they traded him to the Raiders, and then he eventually ended his career on a high note with the Cardinals. After he was traded from the Bengals, they went out in the 2011 draft and drafted Georgia star wide receiver AJ Green and TCU quarterback Andy Dalton, and these two would become the face of the team. Now they had their new Carson Palmer and Chad Johnson. And this is where the video begins, because the next 5 seasons, the Bengals would make the playoffs every year from 2011 through 2015, but they never won a playoff game. But before I get into the present day, I would love to thank Audible for sponsoring this video. I love listening to stories about coaches because that's where I find inspiration to make my videos, and sitting down and reading takes too much focus for me, so listening to an audiobook really helps whenever a coach comes out with a new biography I want to listen to. And Audible has the best service when it comes to finding audiobooks and other audio products for basically everything you could want. And since the Bengals have one of the worst front offices, I wanted to reread Michael Lombardi's book Gridiron Genius, but I wanted to have it on an audio format to listen to because I don't always have time to sit down and read. And he makes so many great points in the book on how to build an organization, and I personally think it is the best book on how a good NFL organization should be run. So if you are a Bengals fan or an NFL fan, you should take a listen to it because it really is that good. So if you want to check them out, they're giving you a free 30-day trial including 1 audiobook and 2 Audible originals. So just head on over to audible.com/cadams or text C Adams to 500-500. You guys will love it. If there's a book out there that you wanted to listen to, you will find it over there. Again, head on over to audible.com/C Adams or text C Adams to 500-500 to start your free trial today. 2011, the Bengals went to the playoffs, and Dalton and Green were the most prolific rookie and wide receiver duo of all time. They lost to the Texans, and then the very next year, they once again made the playoffs, but lost to the Texans during 2012. 2013, they won the AFC North with an 11-5 record, but they lost at home versus the Chargers in the playoffs. 2014, they went 10-5-1, but lost to the Colts in the playoffs in the first round. And then we all know 2015, because the 2015 team started out 8-0 and finished 12-4, and it looked like they were going to get their first playoff win, but they blew their game versus the Steelers and lost 18-16. And if Dalton didn't get injured versus the Steelers in week 13, they probably don't play Pittsburgh in the playoffs, and maybe Cincinnati finally wins a playoff game like everybody wanted. Then 2016, the loss carried over versus the Steelers into the next season because the team went 6-9-1 and had a ton of injuries and missed the playoffs. 2017 started off rough as well, and the team went 5-9, and it looked like Marvin Lewis was on his way out, but they finished the year strong and won 2 straight games versus the Lions and the Ravens and knocked them out of the playoff run and finished 7-9. So Mike Brown kept Marvin Lewis for another year and gave him a 2-year contract, and it looked like it was going to pay off because 2018 started off great. The team went 4-1, but things slowed down. Their defense got worse. AJ Green and Andy Dalton both got injured, and they finished 6-10, and Marvin Lewis was finally fired. And after the Marvin Lewis era ended, Bengals fans were extremely happy because they were finally going to get to see somebody else run the team and maybe capitalize on all the talent they had and get them a playoff win finally. So they went out and hired Zack Taylor, who was the quarterbacks coach and wide receivers coach for the Rams the past 2 seasons. And Zack was also a coach at UC in 2016 and was their offensive coordinator and QB coach. So he was familiar with the area. And now the Zack Taylor era has not started off great. The first game did because they went into Seattle in week 1 and lost by 1 point. But things went bad after that. The team lost 11 straight games before beating the Jets in December. And then they beat the Browns in the last game of the year to finish the year 2-14. And they finished with their worst record since 2002, and things looked pretty bleak. Andy Dalton was benched this year, and his days are over with the team, and they are ready to take a new direction. And this year's draft is set up nicely for them because they're going to get the number 1 QB prospect from Athens, Ohio, who took over college football in 2019, and Joe Burrow is about to go from a Bayou Bengal to a Cincinnati Bengal. Now, where do the Bengals go from here? I don't know if the Bengals will be successful. I'm not up here to predict that because anything could happen. But getting Joe Burrow is the perfect situation for them. Mike Brown has gotten the reputation of being the most stubborn owner in professional sports and will not budge in negotiations. But this works out honestly for this team pretty well when it comes to Burrow because he will not make a trade. He will sit on a player and will not buy into what most teams would do, which is trade a player who isn't happy just to please them. So if Joe Burrow doesn't want to play for them, which I don't think will happen, but all these idiots all over the place keep suggesting that he shouldn't, Mike Brown won't trade him and Joe will eventually play for them, especially if he likes football so much. I mean, not long ago, Joe Burrow would have honestly been thrilled to be taken first overall, and the Bengals are a team that he grew up near, so I can't think of a better quarterback for the franchise to take, and I mean, this kid is literally perfectly made for them. And everyone in the area has convinced themselves that Joe is going to be a Bengal, so this really is a match made in heaven. But I do think this entire situation proves the point that the Bengals might be the worst team in professional football based on everything that goes on in evaluating an organization. But Joe Burrow, if he plays like LSU Joe Burrow, can take Cincinnati back and get them to that place that should be contending in the NFL. And I mean, they seriously would have the second best quarterback in their division, so they should be able to compete there. And having a quarterback that can ball out like Joe did for LSU in 2019 can make up for a lot. But every single problem for the Bengals starts with the man running the team, Mike Brown. Mike Brown is the root of every problem with this team. Now you could argue, hey, you get to work for a guy that is loyal, gives you time, and will let you implement your own system, but you know what, that actually hasn't really worked out so far, and I don't know where to really start with Mike Brown. I mean, the good is that he values contract and relationships with people. He takes chances on problem players and honestly does a good job getting them turned around. He's a loyal guy because you can tell by the fact that they never trade players or get rid of coaches, but the bad is what needs to be focused on because even some of the good is technically bad. So for the bad, he is too loyal to the people that shouldn't be in their position. He's not active in free agency. The scouting department is extremely limited, and they don't have an indoor practice field. He treats his team like a family-run business. They run everything out of Paul Brown Stadium. The respectable thing is that they don't have a stadium sponsor, so it's just named after Paul Brown, his dad. And the Bengals are one of the few NFL teams that don't have a practice facility like I mentioned. Everything is done at their stadium, the front office, the scouting department, coach's office, practice, team meetings, you name it, it's done there. They do have a great weight room and a small turf field, and things look so much better than what they used to be inside the stadium, and they hold practice outside the stadium in the fields, but this is what makes it kind of funny because you can see it from the highway, and it just looks so sad. I mean, every team practices at a facility behind closed doors and can focus, but the Bengals literally straight up practice on the field right next to their stadium while people are crossing over the border of Ohio, Kentucky, and you can see it. And it's funny because they're the most northern team in the NFL without an indoor practice facility, so the team always practices outside next to the highway, and I think that has hurt this team from getting more respect. I think the last time they sold out a game was in 2016, and the attendance keeps dropping, but if they win this year, people will come back, and I don't blame them for not going this year. I wouldn't have even gone this year. Mike Brown runs that team way too conservatively, and people need him to be more aggressive because of the money that honestly the people of the Cincinnati area have invested in the team because of the stadium, so I can understand why people are a little bit frustrated with him and might be wanting to switch teams. But honestly, if the league was about job security, everyone would love playing for the Bengals because Mike never moves on from somebody. He is not a bad person. He's just an old man running a team that needs to change and evolve with the sport. He wouldn't move on from Marvin Lewis, and he was taking forever to move on from Andy Dalton, so you can see what I mean. Now, the good thing is Mike is 84 and the kids are starting to run the operation for him, and you can see progress because the Zack Taylor hire proves that they're trying to get younger and try to keep up with today's NFL. So things have changed going forward, but he and his family have to do a better job running the team and hire people that are fit for their job rather than just being family friends. And honestly, Mike Brown would probably be a great owner to work for in the 70s or 80s, but things change so fast in football and you have to keep up, and that's a big reason why the Bengals haven't been able to. But the thing was, Paul Brown was actually a visionary in the NFL, and that's ironic because his son is not. And honestly, another issue with the Bengals is their scouting department. They have an extremely small scouting department because they're a team that thrives on getting by with less. The coaches do a lot of scouting for the team, so I think that's maybe why they've had a lot of trouble out coaching other teams. Now this is good because it's usually just the head coach, GM, and owner deciding on the players and not arguing with a bunch of people, but the team has so many misses over the past couple of years and only have hit on guys that have had character problems. And I could be wrong, but I think most teams have 20 plus scouts and the Bengals only have around 8, so maybe that's why they have had a hard time drafting. I mean, looking back at the recent success, it's honestly a miracle they were even good. They had a lot of talent, but I personally think the Bengals have had the toughest road in the NFL for success. I mean, I loved him, but Andy Dalton took the Bengals to the playoffs 5 years in a row, which is honestly a miracle considering the franchise's history. And that's why I wouldn't blame Joe Burrow for not wanting to come to the Bengals, but I will say that he might be the only quarterback that can save them based on where he is from, how good he is, and what the Bengals need. They also need Joe Burrow because of the unspoken elephant in the room about the possibility of this team relocating sometime in the future if they keep losing and fans don't show up, and that's going to gain more heat the more this goes on. I've been to Cincinnati many times, and I honestly can't believe they even have an NFL team, just like I can't believe Jacksonville has an NFL team. And the Jaguars are already planning on playing 2 home games in London next year, and if they keep losing, they could move. So the Bengals need a franchise saver, and it starts with getting a quarterback like Burrow. I even know Bengals fans who are starting to turn on the team because of the ownership, and I get it, but Joe Burrow will help get them back because they will start winning games, and that fixes everything. I again don't know where this team is heading, but like I said, a new QB fixes a lot. This is not going to be an easy fix, but I really hope things work out and the Bengals get back to competing for their first ever Super Bowl championship. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed, and subscribe for more stories just like this one.